Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I am honored to be with Dr. Aleem Siddique. Dr. Siddique is a cardiothoracic surgeon in Omaha, Nebraska at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. And one of the things that I think is super intriguing about his story, and as we talk through it, we'll get there, is constantly being open to taking opportunities. And when you take opportunities, doors will open. So, Dr. Siddique, thanks for being with me today.
Thanks, Phil. It's a pleasure.
You
Honored to
bet.
be on your show.
So to start off and just kind of highlight your story, you have a background of international. So talk a little bit about where you're born and the early years growing up.
I was born in England in a small town called Pontefract, and that is in the Yorkshire region, and that's so. My parents have sort of a little bit of a complicated history, but they're of South Asian descent, and they had both settled in England and met there. And they're both doctors, so they met working there, and then they obviously they got married. I was born there in England. My older brother, of course, was also born there, and then I was probably 2 or 3 when we left England, so quite young. And my father, in particular, had family in Pakistan, and the I think there my parents decided that moving to Pakistan would be good for us to grow up in Pakistan. And I think at the time there were some difficulties in England, particularly related to race. And they thought it would be better for us to grow up in Pakistan. So we moved to Pakistan when I was quite young, and then I was in Pakistan until after I completed medical school. Um, but I was fortunate in that we got a chance to maintain a bit of a connection with England too, because we vacationed there and we had family there as well. And I was fortunate in other ways as well.
So growing up, having parents that are in the medical field, being doctors as well, was there ever any pressure or expectation that you would go that route, or did they say, "Hey, whatever it is you want to do," and you just happen to be intrigued by their vocations? Talk a little bit about that growing up.
Yeah, so I remember even as a child thinking that I wanted to be a doctor.
Okay.
Now, I didn't know what kind of a doctor,
Yeah.
and I would confess that I don't think I had really thought about it in any detailed way. It was really an influence of having parents who were both doctors. And so I sort of grew up thinking, oh, I want to be a doctor. Um, and uh, and so I can't say that they really put any pressure on me to do that. Although that's what I was always saying from when I was young. So, they never dissuaded me from doing it either. They were just like, oh, okay. And that's sort of the direction I went. I did a little bit later start to wonder, and this is when I was actually, thinking actively, working to get into medical school. I did wonder a little bit about whether, this was really the right choice for me. And so I did have my doubts at that point, because you sort of come to a point where you're actually doing it, and then you're like, wait a second, did I ever really think about this? Um,
Right.
and medical school in Pakistan is a little bit different than in the United States, because you don't do an undergraduate
Mm,
degree. So you basically go from the equivalent of high school, which is maybe 1 year longer than in the United States,
okay.
but essentially the equivalent of high school, and then you go into medical school directly. And so you sort of make a decision relatively early. And I think there are probably people who went into medical school from in Pakistan from high school, and then found that that wasn't something that they wanted to do. So
Yeah. Well, so once again, I myself did not go to medical school. That would have been a travesty for all parties involved had I. But I also know the rigor that it takes to get through medical school. And I sit there and I think, man, 19 or 18-year-old Phil probably would never have been able to make that work. So talk a little bit about just the dedication and the sacrifice that it takes, to be able to progress through school. I mean, in general, but also at that young of an age.
yeah, it's hard to know a different route, because obviously you only go through one path in time. Um, there clearly is a lot of commitment from the time and education aspect of things. There were friends of mine who didn't go through medical school, who did end up going down different paths, and I did sometimes imagine what that path would have been like at that point, and
Yeah.
wonder if I was missing out on some of that. I guess what I perhaps felt like I was missing out at the time, which now I recollect, rather, it's not really something that I think about now, but as I recollect, I think that at the time I maybe felt like there were other opportunities of things to explore
Mm.
that I didn't, because I didn't have the sort of undergraduate education that you have here. And I could contrast myself with my brother. So my older brother did leave Pakistan and came to the United States and did it and had an undergraduate education before going on to sort of more advanced degrees and stuff. So in comparison to him, and I would talk to him, and he would be doing all kinds of very interesting things, and learning about very diverse things. And so a little bit at the time, I was like, that would have been nice to have done.
Yeah.
Uh, so so I think that now it's not something I think about at all, really. Um, there are, of course, some advantages to going directly into medical school, in that you're a little
Right.
bit younger when you get
Yeah.
done with medical school than people would be in the United States now, and so you gain a little bit uh, in age, perhaps.
Yeah.
Um, Not dramatically, because medical school is longer than in the United States.
Mm.
So you have a little bit more high school, and then you have a little bit more medical school. So it doesn't come out as being a dramatic difference. But
Yeah.
still, you're a little bit younger, which is not necessarily a bad thing as you go into the next stage of life. But you probably
Absolutely.
lose a little bit of diversity in education.
Yeah. So, as your brother had come to the United States, so after medical school, you follow and head to Texas, Texas Southwestern for additional opportunities. So, talk a little bit about making that decision to, leave where family is, leave parents, and and come to a new area.
Yeah, so in practice, there was a period in between
Okay.
before I was in Texas, where I was in Boston. So that was the first
Okay.
place that I was in the United States. And the so a lot of people who go to medical school in Pakistan leave Pakistan to get training, to do the next step of their training.
Got it.
And uh, before my time, well, my time going through medical school, a decade or two earlier than that, people would have mostly gone to England and trained there. And then this was sort of a shift towards people going to the United States. And so it was a fairly well-trodden path, not like a super well-trodden path, but certainly a path that people did take. And so it wasn't, entirely something that people hadn't done before. And so as I was going through medical school, I was certainly thinking, that I would want to take the next step in the United States.
Yeah.
And so during the course of medical school, there are a few things that you do in order to make that possible. And then when I finished medical school, or when I was reaching the end of medical school, I reached out to some people in Boston to do some research there.
Okay.
And that was the next step.
Understood. Now, coming, to the United States, different culture, Boston especially, right? I mean, Boston's just a different city in and of itself than a lot of the other ones in the United States. But, was there a steep learning curve there, or since you had some of the commonalities in, education and, a passion for, this form of medicine, was that a pretty easy transition for you? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, again, it's interesting looking back now through the retrospectoscope, right? It was it was a challenge, I think. I mean, it was a challenge for a variety of reasons. It was a little bit of a cultural challenge. It was not as much of a language challenge because I spoke English well.
Yeah.
It was definitely a financial challenge.
Mm.
And I think I was fortunate to sort of I guess I was fortunate on the way to have people who helped and supported me. There was obviously my parents and family who were supporting me, but they weren't there. And then they were fortunate that as I went to Boston, I there were other people who supported me. And a simple example of that, I was looking for a room to stay in because initially when I got there, I didn't have a place to stay, so I was sort of staying in like a hostel type place. And I was working at the research I was doing was at a hospital that was part of the Harvard University group. And so they have like an area at the university where people advertise places to stay in, rooms to let, and things like that. And I remember I was in there just sort of like trying to find something, and there was a lady who came in and offered up and was putting up an ad, and I just sort of started talking to her, and then she was like, I have a room, and I was like, whoa, I would really need a room. And she was and I told her what my budget was, which was pretty minimal, and she was like, well, that's fine, we will work with that. And she was really good to me, and she knew that I was really strapped financially, and she went out of her way to make it easy for me. And so that's just sort of a simple example of the first step. But I did need the kindness of strangers in the early days, for sure.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and once again, I'd love to hear your take on this, but regardless, we're talking about it in a scope that maybe certain people won't have ever done, and that's, leave family behind and move to a whole new country. But I think at the end of the day, success comes when you have a group of people around you that can help support you, right? It's so hard to do anything at a significant level on your own. At the end of the day, there is that support of others, whether it's financial or emotional, that helps us get through those really tough times.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. 100%. You need those people around you to get you through that. And I was fortunate along the way.
Yes. So as you're progressing through, you said Boston was the first stop, and then was Texas the second one?
Yeah, Texas was the second stop. So you probably already know this, but the when people apply for training in medicine beyond medical school, they get into, we get into a residency is what we call it. And unlike, many jobs where you apply to a job and they either say yes or no, there's a process that's a little bit different. That's called a matching process. And you may already be familiar with this, but essentially what you do as an individual is you rank different jobs or places where you want to train. And the places that are training people rank applicants, and then there's a computer generated match. And I don't know exactly how that computer generates this match, But at the end of it, on a particular day, it spits out, you're going to this place.
Yep.
Okay. and and so that's what it spat out. So it spat out, you're going to the University of Texas Southwestern, which is in Dallas, which is a great place to train in general surgery. And so and it was a place that I was quite keen to go to, so I was really pleased. I guess I have to say that I had, if you had asked me, 5 years before, you'll end up in, or if you told me 5 years before you'll end up in Dallas, I would never have thought, oh, yes, Dallas. I would have been like, where's Dallas? So, but that's where I was told to go. So you sort of take your marching orders and head down to Texas. Now, it's not a total surprise because I did apply there. I did interview there. I did like the place. But obviously in 5 years prior to that, I would have had no sort of idea that I might land there.
So in your time in these different residencies and, maybe Texas specifically, was there anyone that you really felt like you started to, be taken under their wing, or, really someone that you admired that was kind of helping build you and become better at your craft?
Yeah, so for sure, in I'd say in Boston, I I did some research in a lab with a surgeon, and that surgeon, his name was Richard Hoden, and he went out of his way for me, and supported my application, and obviously supported me in my research there. And then when I was in training in Dallas, there were other surgeons who supported me as well. And then the next step after that was actually to end up to go to Tucson and train there. And one of the faculty there sort of took me under his wing. I particularly got interested in some of the things that he was interested in, and actually I continue to work with him, today, which is now,
Wow.
15 years later, and he supported me throughout my career. And so yes, absolutely, there are people who've gone out of their way for me, I feel.
Now, one thing that's always interesting to me whenever you look at kind of having a mentor is there's two dynamics, right? One is the person has to be willing to spend time with you. They usually have to see something in you. Otherwise, they're not going to just take their time out, because they're busy, right? They got other people they can be spending time with, but they usually have to see something. But then second is, as the mentee, you have to be humble enough to take advice. You have to be humble enough to say, I don't know it all. I'm more than happy to learn from you. So talk a little bit about that in, maybe some of the relationships that you've been able to forge that way.
Yeah, that's a great point, Phil, so I guess I haven't really thought about it in that particular way. Um, and so I'm sort of thinking about it a little bit as we talk. The I guess there's a couple of interesting things that I could, that sort of dovetail from there. So one would be that um, now that I'm faculty and have been for some time, I've had the opportunity to work with, several people who are medical students and trainees, and I've tried to be supportive of them. And as you say, there are some who are more receptive and some who are less. And what I've learned over time is that I try to be as upfront with them in the beginning about, if we're going to be involved in any research project or whatever you might have. I think I try to be as upfront with them, or out as honest with them upfront about what it involves, and then I'm completely open to, like, I'm going to be upfront with you, and then you can decide whether you want to do it or not, and if you don't want to do it, that's totally fine. I'd much rather know now than
Yes.
way down the road. The when I was in that position, I'm trying to think back to how it was, and some of the relationships developed a little bit organically. It wasn't you're there working with them, and then over a period of time, I guess maybe they do recognize something in me, and the relationship developed a little bit
Yeah.
organically. There were certainly times when people sort of sat down with me and were clearer about the expectations, etc. as well. And then there were times where people sort of like, I remember one of the persons who's been a fabulous mentee to me at one point saying, sitting down with me and saying, you know what, I don't I have a certain amount of knowledge and I'd be happy to give it all to you. Like there's nothing that I don't want to, I want to hold, it's not like I need to hold this away from you.
Yeah.
I give it all to you. And, that was, at the time was just really impressive to me. Um, and, uh, and I think you're right. You have to be sort of open to receiving that. So there's some openness on both ends. Um, some people have in the medical field have written a little bit on this, but interestingly, I don't know that there's a ton of sort of thought or formal thought that goes into the mentee mentor sort of dynamic.
Yeah.
But I think you bring up interesting points. Is that there's a real commitment on both ends in the process. Um, and at least for me, I think it's helpful to at least set out upfront what the relationship would involve.
Yeah.
Um, then of course it develops as you go along, and in some cases it develops in a way that's really might end up being a lifelong connection.
Absolutely. I love that. Now, as you're continuing to grow, in your practice, the type of work you do is I can't speak to it because I don't do it, but I would imagine, I mean, it's high stress in regards to the type of work that you do, but there has to become a point where it's not overly stressful because you've practiced so much. And I think that's an interesting dynamic of the medical school. Learning it and then doing it are, two different things, right? You have to learn it first, but then at some point you have to be put into action. So talk a little bit about that, maybe any nerves that happen in the beginning, and then just over time as you become, hey, I've done it hundreds of times. I now, have a little bit less nerves, but it's because I've, honed in or I've crafted this skill so well.
Wow, well, that's a really interesting topic as well, Phil. So, um, I think that there is um so there's a thought out there, and I'm not somebody who's read in depth about this, but there's a thought out there that to attain mastery in any particular thing, you need to put in a certain number of hours.
Yeah.
And I think that roughly translates into somewhere around the course of like 10 years of like, pretty solid doing something several hours a day.
Yeah.
Uh, and the same probably applies in surgery. And so, and there is a definite transition in how how things work in along these lines. So you start out in medical school and then you go into residency. Well, residency is where you really train to do surgery and manage patients.
Yeah.
Medical school is a little bit more like the knowledge base, and then there's a practical aspect to it while expanding the knowledge base, and that's largely your residency. And the residency is designed to give you sort of a graduated autonomy through several years where you are more and more practically managing patient problems
Yeah.
under supervision, with the idea being that when you get to the end of that, you're ready to go into practice. Now, um, but you're still not like the finished article by any means. In fact, you're probably
Right.
never the finished article, right? So
Yeah.
then you have achieved a certain amount of knowledge, which and practice. But then the next step is to be independent as a practitioner or a provider in medicine, and that is a big step, and it's a
Yeah.
particularly big step I think, and maybe I'm biased, but again, you can only be in one pathway in your life. So I think it's a particularly big step in surgery because so now you have to actually do the operation, and you go from doing an operation with the supervision of somebody else to doing it independently. And if you're in my field, there's can be big consequences to not getting something right in an operation.
Right.
And man, that is can be really stressful, particularly early on. I mean, I remember for the first, multiple years really, where but particularly the first couple of years where I was like, oh man, if this is like this is your you've got really a lot of you there's really not a lot of margin for error.
Right.
You reflect on things and you're like, man, I can't believe that you can be that close to sort of like being on the wrong side of things in terms of how people do. And so uh, I guess over the course, it probably took me more than 5 years in practice to feel like relatively comfortable about my ability to do things. And part of it is like, you're independent and you're not sure. And every time things don't go perfect, you're like, oh man, am I good enough for this? Can I do this? Should I be here? But eventually, over the course of time, you look back and you're like, you know what, my patients do as well as anybody else's patients, and so I
Yeah.
must be okay. Uh, and um, and so eventually you sort of gain that confidence, but it takes a while. I think people don't talk about that very much in the field. Uh,
Yeah.
but I think that is likely true for most people. Like most people probably go through some period, particularly early in their independent careers, where they're like on tenterhooks, they're doubting themselves, et cetera, et cetera. Now it really helps again to have a supportive team around you, just as
Yes.
just as you said before. Um, and I've been fortunate to have that. And really, when you do go into independent practice, ideally you want to be in a circumstance where when you have questions, when you're unsure of yourself, you have people you can turn to who are readily available to help you. And you never go away from that completely. Like there's always complex issues that will come up. And even now, I've been in practice for my independently for almost 10 years now. Even now, there all the time there'll be stuff that comes up that I'll bounce off other people, et cetera, et cetera. So that never changes. But certainly early on in the first few years, I think having the right group around you is really critical to success.
Yeah. Well, and so in addition to that, and once again, you're going to know all the intricate pieces of your job, but the way I understand it is sometimes you don't have a whole heck of a lot of heads up that something needs to get done. So, I sit there and I think about, a sports, an athlete, right? A week in advance, hey, I have to get mentally prepped for this sporting event by, Sunday at noon because that's when we're going to play the game. Sometimes you have that foresight to know, hey, it's a week, it's a month out. But then there's other times where things just need to get done and you just kind of have to get prepped quickly. So talk a little bit about that dynamic, maybe even early on where you didn't have as much confidence and you had to do it quickly. And now, hey, now that I've done this for a long time, hey, I can be a little bit more cool, calm, and collective on a short notice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the part of the success or part of the key to being successful in surgery is to be able to sort of control your emotions in the moment and not lose your head.
Yeah.
And it as with as with anything, the more you've done something, uh, the the easier it is because you can lean on that what you know and have done repeatedly when you get in trouble.
Yeah.
um, and that's part of why you go through a training program, is so that you get through those moments, at least some, before you get into your own independent practice. When you do, there's also, I think, important to understand that you're always, almost always, better off doing something in a non-emergent fashion, right? And
Yeah.
so if you can calm things down, make a problem less of a problem, that almost always is gonna work out better.
Mm.
But of course, there are circumstances where you don't have that opportunity, where things happen suddenly, and then you have to sort of lean on the things that you know well, and lean on the people around you who are available to support you in that circumstance.
Yeah. Now,
I don't know if that answers your question well.
I think it answers it perfectly. Now, cardiothoracic surgeon. So, talk about maybe the 2 or 3 things or types of surgeries that you spend the most time doing in your practice.
Okay, so yeah, so I mean the commonest operation for most heart surgeons would be to do what's called coronary bypass surgery, which is basically a surgery that we do for people who have blockages in the blood supply to the heart, and you use blood vessel from other locations to bypass that. So that'd be the commonest operation for most cardiac surgeon, including for myself.
Yeah.
The other operations that would be common would be heart valve related surgeries. So that'd be the another common thing. And then I have an interest in doing aortic surgery. The aorta is a blood vessel that comes directly from the heart, and then it's a long blood vessel supplying blood flow through the body. So that's operating on that in the chest is something that I have an interest in. And then another one of my interests is lung transplant, which is sort of a very complex but different field, and for people who have for advanced and irreversible lung disease.
Now, as I understand it, and once again, we didn't talk about how you got to UNMC, so maybe you can preface that. But what the work that you're doing there is, kind of top of the line, leading the way. There's not many other hospitals or institutions that are operating in the same way you guys are at the level you are. So, I guess talk a little bit about how you end up getting to Omaha, and then talk a little bit about what you guys are doing there with the lung transplants.
Yeah, so another example of how you end up in places where you might end up in places where you would never have thought you would be.
Yeah.
And uh, so after I completed general surgery training in Dallas, I so during general surgery training in Dallas, I became interested in doing cardiothoracic surgery. And that was that was not what I thought when I went into general surgery. I was sort of thinking I would do a different line.
Yeah.
But the way general surgery is set up is that you sort of experience during the course of 5 years, you experience several different subspecialties within surgery, and then you might choose to go in the direction of one of those subspecialties if it interests you. And so I sort of got interested in cardiothoracic surgery, and so as I finished my training in general surgery, I applied for training in cardiothoracic surgery, which is a subspecialty that involves more years of training. So and again, there's this match process.
Yeah.
And so I matched into the program at the University of Arizona, which is in Tucson,
Yeah.
which again, I wouldn't have necessarily thought that I would be there. Of course, I applied there and I liked the place, and I was fortunate to get in. And so that was sort of the next stop in the training. And while I was there, I one of the faculty there was a surgeon by the name of Michael Moulton, and he was the lung transplant surgeon there, and was while I was there was sort of also in charge of my training for a period, and the chief of the division there. And so I did my first lung transplant, was as a trainee with him doing, being the surgeon, like the faculty surgeon.
Yeah.
And in the first one I did, I was like, wow, this is really great. And I hadn't seen lung transplant prior to that. So
Yeah.
I'd gone into it thinking I want to do cardiothoracic surgery, but I hadn't developed a further subspecialty interest at that point. So,
Yeah.
the first one I was like, oh, this is great. And so, uh, so I got interested in that, and I loved working with him, and we've remained, in touch since. And he's, I still work with him. So that was 2 years in Tucson, during which time I was fortunate to see a fair amount of lung transplant, get really
Yeah.
interested in it. And I knew while I was in my second year, that I wanted to do that as part of my ongoing career. So
Yeah.
the next step was to get some further training in that, which actually took me back to England. Um, but after I left Tucson, Michael Moulton actually ended up moving from there to where I currently am, the University of Nebraska, as the chief of the division here. And so when I finished my additional training in England, I was looking for a job and sort of like done with my training finally. Uh, and and he was the natural person, because I'd already worked with him. I knew he was great. I wanted to work with him
Yes.
more. And he was looking for someone to do lung transplant with here in Omaha. So that's where I took my job, and now I've been here, almost 10 years. We started a lung transplant program which didn't exist
Yeah.
in Nebraska prior to that. So we started a program, and that's been active for a little bit over, a bit over 5 years. And obviously we're trying to use that to help people who have end-stage lung disease in the region.
Yeah.
And
Well,
as you say, there's a relative lack of programs of that nature in the region.
yeah. So I was going to say, I mean, on an annual basis, and maybe you know, maybe you don't know, but I mean, what percentage of transplants do you think you guys do here in Omaha versus maybe across the country?
Oh, we're doing a small percent of what's being done in the
Yeah.
country. We're this is a relatively, not a very population dense
Mhm.
region. Um, and the incidence of any illness is obviously, where there's more population, you'll see more of that. So
Right.
so there's, more lung transplants being done along the coast, but there's not many centers in this part of the country,
Got it.
which means that, although the population isn't dense, we're sort of the only program in this area that you have to go a little bit further geographically to find another program.
Yeah. Now, one thing I'd be curious to, know a little bit about is with a job that has as much stress and demand as yours does, how does one be able to not leave work at work? Because I think that's an overrated statement. It always comes home with you. I mean, anything you do for the majority of your day is going to going to be a part of the rest of your day. But how are you able to then transition and say, all right, now I'm dad, now I'm husband, and I need to put work aside for a little bit to free up, my capacity for my family.
Yeah, well, I don't know that I have the answer to that, Phil. I mean, I'm not necessarily the role model for that. So you're right, work very much does end up coming home, and I'm lucky with the support I get at home, and the
Yeah.
fact that people aren't kicking me out of the home. Particularly if you're in the transplant field, which I am, there's stuff related to transplant that happens all 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Um, One of the things that a friend of mine told me, and I try to remember this, is that, particularly for my I have two boys, so particularly for them, is that they really don't want anything much more than your time, right?
Yeah.
But time is kind of perhaps the most precious thing that we have.
Absolutely.
But boy, I try to remember that just need to take a little bit of time. They don't necessarily want a lot of time, but if they ask for something or they have something planned, then I obviously I try my best to give them that time and a little bit of my time. But I am in no in no way the role model for that aspect of things.
No, I love that. And I think it's so true. And my friends know this about me, and I tell them frequently, I go, I don't always have the most quantity of time, but the time that I will give you, I won't be checking my cell phone, right? I'm not going to be looking at emails. I'm not going to be texting people back. Like, I will give you an hour. I would love to give you 4, but maybe I only have an hour. But in that hour, it is, you and I dedicated time. I promise I will try not to be interrupted. So I think
Yeah, you
there's a
make a
lot to be said about that.
yeah, you make a great point. Yeah, I could do better with that. I absolutely recognize your thought on that, though. I think that we can get too caught up in the phone, and I certainly do. But if you can give people quality time, so it's the time plus it's the quality of the time, isn't it?
Yes,
And
yes.
you want to do both of those things ideally.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Once again, it's been a conversation piece amongst my circle because they're like, Phil, you're never around for like 4 or 5 hours. I'm like, I'm not, but if I was around for that long, it wouldn't be very good, because eventually I would need to do things, right? But if I'm here for an hour or two, I can promise that you will get all of me. And once again, I know myself well enough. I don't even keep work email on my phone because it's like I know I would start checking it. So I try and put some guards up on my, you know, on the controllables. That way I can, be focused when I'm with people. So
I think that's a great point. There's one of the things I've thought about but I haven't done is to go back to a dumb phone,
yeah. Yeah.
right? And it's like, maybe then you could just sort of step away and put some of this stuff aside.
Right.
And I'm so dependent on my phone for work that it would be so I'm not sure how I would actually achieve that, but it's definitely crossed my mind that if I were able to set that aside or then that would lead to better quality of time.
Yes. Well, Dr. Siddique, I know you've got kiddos to take to a football game. And so, on the topic of time with kids, I want to make sure I honor that. But thank you so much for just sharing your journey and, I mean, all the amazing things that you've done and are doing. And honestly, just can't wait to continue to watch your journey. And, in probably 3 or 4 years, we'll have to do this again and talk about the new advances and things you've learned and all the great things you've continued to do.
Thank you, Phil. This has been great, and it's great talking to you, and lovely to be on your podcast. Hope to see you soon outside of work, and we can find some quality time, hopefully.
Yes.